Thank you, everyone, for joining once again. This is our last session of the Tri-County Winter Webinar Series. And tonight we're going to be talking about maple syrup and basically just everything you need to know to get started, whether you're kind of a backyard tapper or maybe you're trying to start up a business. We're kind of going to go over everything. So if you guys want to kind of share in the chat, if you're interested in starting maple syrup, or if you're someone that's been tapping trees for a while, kind of let me gauge if you are a beginning maple syrup person or you're here just to watch because you're interested. Type your answer in the chat so I can kind of see where we're at. That would be helpful. I'll wait a little bit. Thanks, Keith. Thank you, Penny. Awesome. So it looks like we got some people that are brand new beginner. Um, I am as well. So we're going to be learning all together. And this presentation, I've done a few presentations on maple syrup and some workshops in the past, and it's been really fun to kind of go and see the setups that people have. We just did a maple syrup workshop back in April, which was super fun. So I'm new to it as well. So we kind of wanted to get this curriculum out and pull together because we didn't think that there were a lot of maple syrup classes out there, especially with extension. So hopefully this presentation will give you a good start. So right away, I'm going to go over kind of the background of maple syrup and share the Native American story related to maple syrup and sap flow. And then I'll discuss the importance of syrup nutritionally and also talking about tree identification. So there are different Native American tribes that have a different way of telling the story about maple sap and syrup, but the story is very similar across the board. And it's about a god, and he came to check on his people to find the village strangely silent. And the gardens in this village had been taken over by weeds, and all of the cooking fires were dead. And he found his people laying in the nearby woods under the maple trees with their mouths gaping, getting the syrup from the trees to drip into them. And the god did not like to see his people so lazy. So he took fresh water and using his powers, he filled the trees until the syrup ran from them, thin and fast. And he ordered the people to get up and told them that by adding the water, the syrup was no longer pure and it would only run during the winter when the game is scarce, the water is frozen, and crops don't grow. And even then, they would still have to process it to eat it. And in the meantime, they would need to hunt and fish, gather edible plants, and tend to their gardens. And maple syrup was and still is produced mainly in the Great Lakes region from sugar maple and black maple species. Once the sap is processed and considered syrup, it contains an abundance of nutrients, sugar being the highest of those concentrations, which is an energy source from the body in the form of glucose. And this is why it was so essential to Native Americans in this region. And minerals like iron, zinc, manganese, and potassium are needed in our diets, and they allow the human body to transport oxygen from the lungs to tissue, regulate our muscle and nerve function, and overall develop our bodies. So, when does SAP run in Minnesota? SAP runs when the daytime temperatures are between 30 and 40 degrees Fahrenheit and freezing at night. And you can see by this graph here from the DNR seeing the sap go freezing during the night and then flowing during the day on the warm days. And several days of this pattern are really needed for a sufficient amount of sap to run, but sap will run regardless of favorable conditions. And so we call this a run or a sap run. And this usually happens in Minnesota around March 15th until April 20th, but these dates are subject to change based on the climate and also weather patterns. I know last year, when we had our maple syrup workshop, the farm that I was working with, they tried to tap a few trees back in January and early February because we had that warm, odd winter weather. And then, so they tapped trees that they didn't usually tap before, just to see what they would get. And then during the normal sap run from March to April, that's when they tapped all of their regular trees. So, since Native Americans long ago didn't have thermometers, they used phenology, which is the study of cyclic and seasonal natural phenomena, especially in relation to climate, plant, and also animal life. So, the Native Americans would watch for the crows and eagles to come back to the land, and that's how they knew it was time for the sap run. And each run produces 1 gallon of sap, and the tree will typically have between 8 to 10 runs in a season. In order to make 1 gallon of maple syrup, 30 to 40 gallons of sap is required, usually closer to 40 gallons to be boiled down. So, if you wanted a gallon of maple syrup, you would probably plan to tap roughly 4 trees, and these amounts vary depending on the type of tree species that are being tapped. But best management practices for sustainability suggests that it's best to only tap a tree once a year that is at least 12 inches in diameter. So, every tree produces sap. If you've ever cut a tree down, you would have noticed that the tree is damp where the cut is made, and this is the tree sap. But we don't all use all trees for syrup production. Only certain species produce sap that can be used to make syrup. And the most common tree species that we think about is obviously maple trees because all of our syrup is called maple syrup. But there are other trees that you can tap as well, like box elder, black walnut, birch trees. And when you're looking to get started with syruping, first you have to identify what type of trees that you already have established and also have the ability to use. And planting the desired tree species can be done, but it'll take a lot of years to grow to the optimal diameter of 12 inches. So for a maple tree to reach 12 inches in diameter, it'll probably be 25 to 30 years. And the most common trees on the list are obviously maple, but also box elder is another common one because it contains a sweet sap that is desirable for flavor too. And so tapping the most common sap producing established trees is a good place to start, but it's also good to be aware that the syrup taste changes based on what type of tree you use. So, for example, if you tapped a birch tree, birch syrup and the different ways in which it can be processed cause a taste that ranges from like smoky and burnt to a sweet hint of raspberry. And then on the other hand, if you have black walnut syrup, it has like a little smoother and nuttier taste than maples. But all these tree options allow you to kind of play around with taste and find out what suits you best. So, when identifying a maple tree, it's really easy to mark them in the summer when their leaves are out. Most people are fairly familiar with the popular shape of the maple tree, and I'll kind of go over these three here. So, the sugar maple has leaves with five prominent points on them with those U-shaped spaces, and the edges are smooth on them. With the red maple, the leaves usually only have those three prominent lobes and then the V-shaped sinuses, and then their edges are kind of like jagged. And then obviously, you see that red color in the fall. And then with the silver maple, those sinuses are very prominent compared to the other two, very deep. And then usually with the silver maple, um, if you see a tree like blowing in the wind and you see the underside of the leaf, usually the underside of a silver maple has that like silvery white color. If you don't know if you have a maple tree and you're starting to tap in the winter, identifying the branches is a good start. Maples and ash trees are the only trees in this region that have an opposite branching pattern. So you can see in the top first circle there, opposite is right across from each other rather than alternate. So like an oak tree would have an alternate branching pattern. So it's not right across from each other. Another way to identify is through the buds. So on red maples, the buds are usually very round and dark red. On sugar maples, they're very slender and pointed. And I like how this sugar camp guide says that they kind of look like sugar cones. It's kind of cool. And then with the silver maples, those buds are red and very large, and they usually have like a cluster of them on the terminal bud, which is on the end. And I also wanted to add in a few more color pictures for you for the tree. So the black maple here, it kind of looks like a different leaf shape, not as deep of sinuses there. And then the sugar maple here, just for reference. Sugar maple and the sugar cone with their terminal bud. And then with the bark too, the bark of maples is usually grayish with irregular ridges, and you can see that with the sugar maple there. And then here we have the silver maple leaf again with the twig, and then the bark there too with those irregular ridges. And then the red maple. Something that I thought was really interesting from our workshop this past April was that the farm that we were working with kind of went by a rule of thumb that every single tree that he sees that has these whitewashed lichens on them is usually a maple. And so I did some research on there, and the articles that I read did indicate that these lichens that are growing on the tree could be a good sign that you do have a maple. I'm not necessarily sure why. The manual didn't go super in depth with it, but the tree and the lichens just may have a really good relationship, I guess. And then this is a picture of a box elder tree. Different leaf shape there, but also kind of similar to the maple as well. And then the black walnut is another tree species that is being studied on. I know that at the University of Minnesota Landscape Arboretum, they are actually doing research on black walnut syrup and getting people in to taste test the syrup that's being made to see if it's good. But obviously, we all know black walnuts because they have that thick, hard fruit that falls to the ground, smashes down. But also, another good way to see if you have a black walnut or that the buds are gray and fuzzy. And then the leaf scar that it makes, you can kind of see here on this black and white twig picture. It looks like a monkey's face. All right, now we'll get into the timeline and history of syruping. So, the first written accounts of maple syrup in North America happened in 1557, but the Native Americans had been using sap from maple trees long before then. And in 1606, the Micmac Indians have documentation of collecting and distilling sap, and their knowledge of maple syruping was passed on to colonists shortly after. And according to one account written in 1799 by Colonel James Smith, who was a captured and adopted colonist by the Native Americans in 1955, when there were no kettles for boiling the sap they harvested, they froze the water out of the syrup until it changed color and became a sticky substance instead. And so the practice of freezing changed to boiling with the use of hot stones, and later the sap was boiled over an open flame. And before long, syruping in North America was promoted and manufactured. In 1818, it became cheap enough for consumers to select it over cane sugar from the West Indies. And right after consumers gained easy access and were accustomed to using maple sugar and syrup, the producers were introduced to the sugar shack slash sugar house for boiling down sap. In 1860, there became a patent on the first metal tap, and the same year was the peak production at 40 million pounds of maple sugar and 1.6 million gallons of syrup that were reported to the USDA. And according to the University of Vermont, it wasn't until the Civil War that the maple syrup industry was born, with the introduction of the tin cans and the invention of metal spouts and evaporator pans. Most early producers were usually dairy farmers who made maple syrup and sugar during the off season of the farm for their own use and for extra income. The Vermont Maple Sugar Association was formed in 1893, which was extremely beneficial to the syrup industry because they played a huge role in setting the industry-wide standards across the country. And shortly after that, in 1906, the U.S. passed the Pure Food and Drug Act, which declared alteration of maple syrup with glucose illegal. And then in 1959, the plastic sap collecting pipeline system was patented by Nelson Griggs. And this development made it easier for producers to collect more sap while also decreasing the labor needs. Other than the pipeline system from 1861, the technology remained largely the same for the next century until the energy crisis of the 1970s forced maple syrup producers to change their labor-intensive process. With another surge of technological breakthroughs, tubing systems were perfected, taking the sap directly from the tree to the sugar house. And these technological advances continue today to keep the maple syrup industry moving forward. And many current syruping operations use the plastic tubing system that you see here in this picture to collect sap in a bulk tank within the sugar house. Nelson Griggs, along with George Breen, were engineers, and Robert Lamb, who was a business owner, were both inexperienced in maple syrup production, but saw the potential to create something that would collect syrup more efficiently. So, inventors before created wood and metal collection trays and channels, but never before had plastic been available or accessible. But nowadays, this tubing is used across the country. Reverse osmosis technology is used in maple syruping in large and small scale production systems for concentrating maple sugar from the raw sap. And we're gonna take a look at a video here from Cornell University Extension, which explains what reverse osmosis is and how it works.
Old Spice Gentleman Super Hydration Body. Reverse osmosis is kind of a technical name put on something that's actually fairly simple. And that is, osmosis is when you have a membrane between a solution that has a lot of solvent in it, such as salt or sugar or something like that, and then the other side of the membrane has pure water. And what happens in that case is the water will cross the membrane to join the side that has something in solution. When we use reverse osmosis, we put that side with sugar on it in under pressure, sometimes a fair amount of pressure, and that'll actually push water out of the solution through the membrane to the side that has no sugar. Well, the science behind it is what you have in a membrane is what we would call maybe a sheet polymer, and that polymer is chemically linked in such a way that it creates holes that are a very specific size, and they can make these polymers so that the holes are a big variety of sizes. So when we're talking about maple syrup, in that case, the holes in the polymer are the right size so that water passes through but sugar cannot. So when we put the sap under pressure against this sheet polymer that's part of that's the membrane, water will pass through the membrane and leave the sap, and the sugar then gets concentrated as it goes through the reverse osmosis membrane. The big advantage with reverse osmosis is that it takes almost no energy to remove that water. Whereas when you boil to remove the water, it takes about 10,000 BTUs per gallon of water removed. So instead of boiling for 8 to 10 hours on a run for a backyarder, now he only has to boil for an hour to maybe 2 hours at the most to get the same amount of syrup. That makes it fun in my book, not grueling. Well, if you were to look at a commercial reverse osmosis machine, it has all the bells and whistles. It has the wash systems built into it. It has temperature control so that if things get too hot, they shut down. It has pressure controls so that they automatically shut down. And those are all wonderful to have. But the backyarder doesn't necessarily need all of those things. And we'll explain as we look at some different sizes of ROs just how simple it actually is for someone to put together their own reverse osmosis machine. Reverse osmosis has sort of traditionally been for the largest maple producers, and our goal is to change that. Our goal is to make it available to everyone from the huge maple producer right down to someone who may even only have 5 or 6 taps, just because it makes maple syrup so much more fun and energy efficient.
Okay, so you can see from the video that reverse osmosis systems help to decrease the boiling time significantly. And in this picture that just popped up, this is a large boiling pan, and it has more surface area, which decreases the time required to achieve a boiling point. And H. Allen Sewell designed the first evaporator with 2 pans and a metal arch or firebox in 1872 to decrease boiling time. But now you can buy a rectangular or square boiling pan with a spigot at Home Depot or Amazon, ranging from around $150 to $300. So, Lauren is going to send out a poll to everyone asking if you know what the top producing state of maple syrup is. And the options are New York, Minnesota, Vermont, or Wisconsin. About 26 of you have answered. Okay, we'll end the poll there. So 74% of you were right. Vermont was the top, I shouldn't say was, Vermont is the top maple syrup producing state um, in the country. And according to the USDA 2022 production data, Vermont produced 2.5 million gallons of maple syrup. And based on that number, they produce about half of the nation's maple syrup, which is pretty crazy considering how small of a state they are. And the second leading state is New York with 845,000 gallons. Maine is the third leading state with 672,000 gallons produced. And then Wisconsin is next, and then Michigan are the last two states that make up the top five producers of maple syrup. So, according to the USDA, maple syrup is an iconic as well as economically and culturally important non-timber forest product in North America. And the economic benefits derived from maple syrup production are extremely substantial. Just based on the reports from the USDA in 2016, the US produced 4.2 million gallons of syrup worth an estimated $147 million. And in addition to that, sugaring provides many with a deep personal connection to the forest land that also provides a means to develop social capital and support rural identity, and also a way to keep a valued family or cultural tradition alive. But there are some challenges currently facing the maple syrup industry, including the potential range shifts in maple trees, or also bringing in other trees because of climate change, the increased variability in the timing. Like I said, this past year we tapped in January and February and then tapped again in March and April. There's also obviously the threats from invasive species, pest disease, different land transfers as people are getting out of farming and land being sold off commercially. And also high equipment costs is another one too. So, Minnesota native tree ranges are changing, and you could help with assisted migration, which is planting trees in northern locations that isn't historically that species range. And we have a lot of resources on assisted migration on the Extension website. And this process takes tree seed sources and populations from southern Minnesota or even Iowa to, say, a more northern location. So, like an example would be moving a sycamore tree from northern Iowa into southern Minnesota. And already producers are dealing with the change in timing of the sap runs due to climate change, like I said. And then, it affects the duration of the sap run and also the yield produced. And there are quite a few programs actually that syrup producers can apply for to help with equipment, supplies, storage facilities, all that type of thing. And the first one is from the Natural Resource Conservation Service. They have an EQIP grant program, which allows producers to receive funding to purchase equipment and supplies. And then the farm storage loan from the Farm Service Agency, or FSA, is for purchasing equipment used for storing maple syrup or sap. The FSA also offers a direct farm operating loan, which can be used for business operating purposes. The USDA offers a Rural Energy for America program, which has been used in the past for reverse osmosis plants and sap preheaters. And producers are also encouraged to talk with the local soil and water conservation districts and the Board of Water and Soil Resources for more info on cost share programs as well. Now we'll start to get into the basic equipment and supplies that you would need to get if you wanted to start tapping trees. This right here is a general list of a hobbyist or a backyard producer. Typically, large sugar bushes will have the tubing systems, but if you're small, these four items are basically what you need, and we'll get into them. So, along with a hammer, you'll need drills and bits, and it's important to know what size spout you'll be using or tap. So, you'll want to select a bit that is relative to the tap size and is also designed to remove the wood shavings while drilling your hole into the tree. It's also good to make sure that you carry an extra drill bit just in case it breaks. And it is recommended that the drill bits be replaced after every 2,500 tap holes due to wear and tear. But I mean, if you just have a few trees in your backyard, you should be fine. And the type of taps that you use is determined by your collection method. So some taps have hooks that can hook right onto the bucket. You can see the middle picture there with a hook, and then the top one with a hook. And they come in the following sizes, so a quarter, 5/16, and 7/16. And then we'll go into the different methods next. So we're gonna watch another video on how to tap. And one thing that she says during this video is like the measuring phase, like 20 to 24 inches in diameter, you can put in two taps, but Extension recommends that for sustainability and tree health, that you only put in one tap per tree per season, no matter the size.
You need a drill, you'll need a hammer, you'll need some taps to collect the sap out of the tree, and you need some kind of food-safe container to gather your sap in. So you might have something like this. You might use an old water jug or an old well-rinsed milk jug. You can get a nice bucket from a maple dealer, and that's a handy thing to have too. Now you also need to know that your tree is big enough to tap. I don't think we have to worry about that here, but you want a tree, before you ever tap it, it should be at least 10 to 12 inches in diameter at breast height. And as soon as it's 10, you can put one tap in it. Up to 20 should have one tap. Between 20 and 24, you can put in two taps. And if the tree is more than 24 inches in diameter, you can put in three if the tree is healthy. To tap the tree, you need a portable drill and you need a drill bit. You might be tempted to just run into the barn and get a drill that looks like it's the right size. Don't use a drill bit like this one. If you wouldn't eat off of this, then you shouldn't use it for making a food product. This is an old rusty drill bit. We're not going to use this one. Okay, so we changed out our drill bits and got rid of that rusty one. We used a nice, clean, sharp, new drill bit. And we've marked the drill bit to show how far we're going to drill into the tree. If you're using a 5/16 inch spout, a smaller one, you'll only need to drill about 1.5 inches. If you're drilling using a 7/16 inch spout, you'll need to drill about 2 inches. You want to drill at a slight uphill angle so the sap will run out of the tree. If you don't have a rechargeable drill, you can use a brace and bit, and that works just as well. Notice that our tap hole that we're drilling here is at least 6 inches away from any other tap hole side to side, and it's no closer than 2 feet above or below an older tap hole. And it's nice and clean. We'll clean it out with a twig to make sure that tap hole is nice and clean. We're not going to blow in it and get any germs in there that will seal the tap hole over. Now we have our tap. This tap has a hook to hang our bucket on, so we're going to put that into our tree, and then they call this tapping for a reason. You're not going to wail away on this. If the tree is frozen and you hammer really hard, you have a chance of splitting the tree. There you can see the sap is already coming out. So we're going to hang our bucket on the tree like so. And because we don't want leaves and twigs and squirrel droppings and birds to put anything in our sap, we put a cover on the sap as well. So we're going to collect this sap and then we're going to boil it down and make syrup out of it.
Okay, so she kind of talked about a collection container a little bit, but once your sap starts to flow, you'll need something to collect that. And so we're going to be looking about the different ways of collecting it, but just remember that the main requirement is to have something that is food grade, and it's also best to have something that has a lid or a closed container, like she mentioned, keeps out debris, and animals out of the sap as well. And there are three different types of collection methods: a bucket, a bag, and a pipeline system. And we'll go through each of the different methods and consider the costs and maintenance and labor. So the first method is the bucket system, and this is kind of the traditional method that's been used in areas that are far from the sugar house, or if there are smaller amounts of total taps being used. And it's super essential for this method to have a secured lid on the buckets for food health and safety concerns. Hearing stories of many producers, opening up their bucket, or, seeing that something is in there like squirrel droppings or mice, it's good to have a lid in there to cover it. And taps designed with a hook are used for this system, and some systems using a tubing spout and connecting the tubing into the bucket container works too. And the best practice is to collect the sap as quick as possible, because it shouldn't sit for more than a few hours. The bagging method is another very common method, especially for homeowners or people on a small scale. Some benefits of this method are decreased storage space, and also you can see, how much sap you have in the bags. Some disadvantages to this method are that the bag could freeze and split, and animals could damage the bag. I've heard stories of animals chewing at the bags, and that can cause major losses. And some of the bags are on the smaller side, so if you do have a large sap run, the bags can overflow. So just making sure that with this system that you're frequently checking the bags is best practice. And then if you wanted to reuse these bags, you can. Just washing them would be another time and labor expense. And while visibly being able to see how much sap was collected is a benefit, the bag transparency could cause more sunlight penetration, which could increase the temperature of the sap and cause spoilage too. And the tubing system was introduced in the 1950s, and it's helped the maple industry to be economically viable. And the tubing system allows you to cover a large area using a network of tubing that feeds into one big main line that goes directly into the collection container. And this decreases your labor costs through eliminating trips for emptying your containers. And you can leave this system up all year round, but you'd have to check the lines, do some maintenance before the next flow because damage could have occurred within that year. And then for this method, if you wanted to increase the volume, a mechanical vacuum could be attached to the system. Most tubing has a diameter of 5/16, and the line that has a diameter of 3/16 on an incline will have a natural vacuum. And this setup has an estimated lifespan of around 15 to 20 years. And this section will kind of go into storing sap and getting into finished products. So like I mentioned before, with every tree you tap, you get about 7 to 10 gallons of sap, and every 40 gallons is equivalent to 1 gallon of syrup. So you'll need a storage container. And it is essential to understand that keeping sap stored too long or at too high of temperatures will reduce syrup quality. And signs of spoilage can include cloudiness or murkiness. It could also mean that it's ropey or stringy, and it also could smell like spoiled milk. But if you have like a slight color to it, that should be okay. And the sugar content could vary depending on the batch per season, especially from individual tree performance and the temperature out. If you have maple sugar, if you want to make maple sugar, the average sap sugar concentration is 2%. And in order to reduce the boiling time and concentrate the sap, most of the large operations use that reverse osmosis system. Boiling equipment varies between producers because there are literally so many different options. If you're looking for a cheaper option, you could use a barrel stove, cinder blocks, turkey pot, metal pans, but there are also other commercially made equipment out there. These are some examples of different methods that producers use. A lot of these are homemade. So when you are watching your syrup and you're getting towards the end of boiling, it's important to know that it's very easy to burn. And what you're kind of going for is looking at the density, and the density is measured by degrees Brix, which is the measure of dissolved solids in a liquid and is commonly used to measure dissolved sugar content of an aqueous solution. So a hydrometer measures density, or you could also use a refractometer to measure sugar content. Um, with these tools as well, you can also check for sheeting, which is when you lift like a spoonful of syrup rather than dripping it off and it just slides off in a sheet. I think that's all for this one. So what else can you make besides syrup? So other maple products are possible, and I'm sure that you've seen them at like craft fairs and stuff. I love different maple products. Maple sugar, like we've mentioned, this whole presentation, is a product, and that was traditionally used by Native Americans because it's easy to store and transport. Maple cream is very delicious. I love maple cream, and it's pure maple syrup boiled, cooked, and then stirred to make a cream cheese type of mixture. And I know that other producers, have tried to like flavor their maple syrup, and gone about that, but just make sure that if you want to try something new in terms of making food, just make sure that it's research based or you contact some of our food safety educators. So now that you kind of have a grasp on how to tap, and what to make, it's probably best that you know where you can even tap and the rules and regulations behind that. So, obviously, you can tap on your own private land, but if it isn't your own, just make sure that you're asking permission from the landowner. Public land that is county or city land, make sure you contact them ahead of time because each county and city has their own regulations. And then, according to the DNR, state forest land requires a permit. And the most recent information that I have lists the permit at $25 for 100 trees. And Minnesota has two national forests, the Chippewa and Superior. And to syrup on national forest land, you will need to get a permit. So if you're interested in doing that, you would need to call the Forest Service for more information. So now that you've got everything figured out and you want to sell your product, what do you even need to do to be able to sell in Minnesota? Well, it could be divided into three categories: licensed food, cottage food, or farm product. Licensed foods must be prepared and bottled in an inspected kitchen space to be sold to retailers. With cottage foods, you can sell directly to a consumer with a cottage food license. And lastly, syrup can be a product of the farm if the syrup is harvested from trees on your personally owned, rented, or leased property, and there cannot be any added ingredients for product of the farm products. And if you have more questions about selling licensed foods or what kind of license you would need, please get in touch with the University of Minnesota Food Safety Team because they will be able to help you out with that. So, some of the best practices for respecting our natural resource that we have here in Minnesota, we want to make sure that we're practicing sustainability by managing our tree health. So, tapping trees at the proper time of year is a good way of doing that, making sure that your trees are being taken care of, if they're in their backyard. We just went through, a few years of drought and then a crazy wet spring and then a drought again. So, making sure that you're keeping or taking care of your tree is ideal. And then, like I've mentioned before, sustainability methods mean that you are selecting a tree that is 12 inches or in diameter or more and only tapping the tree once per season. If we do have, another crazy year where you could possibly get a tap in January, February, I would make sure that you're not tapping your best producing trees, that you tap in the regular sap run from March to April. And then to kind of wrap up here with some resources, the North American Maple Syrup Producers Manual is amazing, and it basically aided in this entire presentation that I've given tonight. It is very comprehensive and it is available to you just on that link up top, z.umn.edu/maple manual. It's based on researched and authored by professionals. Um, we also have little syrup kits, and we have a copy of it. So I would check with your local extension educator to see if you could take a look at a hard copy. For people in Wright, McLeod, and Meeker counties, I do have a hard copy of the manual, and I also do have a syruping kit, which has the different methods of production. Like I have some taps as an example, some hooks, buckets, lids, the bag system. So if you're interested in kind of learning more and getting some hands-on practice with it, just reach out to your local extension educator and we can see what type of resources we have for you. And the Minnesota Maple Syrup Producers Association was super key in helping us put together this presentation and also all of the curriculum that we've made for maple syrup and educational materials for today. And if you're interested in learning more about them, I would visit their website. They have a lot of terrific information, and they also have kind of a directory of who is producing maple syrup in Minnesota. So if you're someone that wants to see this in person being done by someone, just reach out through that directory as well. And then another special thanks to SARE, which is the Sustainable Ag Research and Education Center, for supporting these materials, curriculum, and also training for us extension educators. And then Stu and Steve from the Minnesota Maple Syrup Producers Association contributed to this as well. And then the Department of Natural Resources um, has some information too, as well as our extension website. And with that, I will look to answer any questions that people have.
There was one question that came in, and it said the question is, can you mix the trees that you tap when you're making syrup, or should you only stick to one type?
Yeah, you definitely can mix the trees, but if you were mixing like black walnut with a sugar maple, it would probably mess up like the sugar content and also the flavor of it. So I would just be aware that it could definitely, mess with the recipe that you're doing or boiling. Um, when we were training for this presentation and getting all this information, the Minnesota Maple Syrup Producers Association actually brought in various different types of syrup that we got to taste test. So we got to see, which one tasted bad and which one tasted good. And there's a really good resource out there that kind of gets information about like flavor profiles and everything. So it would probably definitely mess up the flavor and the sugar content. I'm not sure if there are any food safety concerns with that though. Oh, the grades of maple syrup. Yeah, I th that was just what I was talking about too. I'll need to write these questions down so I can get back to everyone on this because I don't have the grades off the top of my head, but good question. Autumn blaze appropriate for tapping. Good question, Mary. Um, I guess it can be yes. My thing with autumn blaze is that I see a lot of issues with them. So I would make sure that the health of your autumn blaze um is good first before you tap the tree. But you could definitely try it out. I don't know what the scientific name of autumn blaze is, but um, when doing small quantities of tapping, anything to keep in mind. Um, I guess just making sure that you're not over tapping your tree. If you are doing like 5 trees in your backyard and they are bigger trees, it can kind of get to be tempting to over tap them to get more sap so you can make syrup. But just making sure that you're not putting more taps is kind of my advice. And then using the bag method is probably good for, or the bucket method too. Sugar maples in Minnesota. Yes, there are sugar maples in Minnesota. 3 different sizes of taps. Yeah, there are varying sizes. And it goes along with the drill bit that you're using. Um, Let me see if I can pull up. Um, Here, let me share my screen with this resource. Lauren, tell me if it's not the right screen. So this resource here, I can send these out to people too. But this is also, it should be in the maple syrup producer's manual. Um, but usually 7/16, a 1/4 of 5/16 is kind of like, so standard is 1/4 to 5/16. Um, so that's kind of what they recommend, if that helps at all. And then the bit should match that too, so it fits in there. Very good questions, everyone.
There was a question in the chat as well. Where can I get more information on small scale reverse osmosis?
Mm. I can look into it and get back to you on that. I'm sure like the NRCS would have some info. I don't think the extension website does, but I can find a good resource for you. These are really good questions, everyone. Hopefully, I can get these resources all pulled together in a folder so that once I send out the link to everyone, you guys can view it. Thanks, James. I will get that info to you guys. All right. Well, if you guys have any more questions, you all have my email and my phone number, I think, is on there. But if not, you'll get the recording to this webinar tomorrow, hopefully. But otherwise, make sure you check out the Meeker County Extension YouTube page because that's where all the other recordings are. So, thank you again, everyone. I really appreciate you attending tonight, and this was our last session. So, have a happy holiday season.